This week on The Record, the fight for Southern Illinois, Darren Bailey versus Mike Bost. What's at stake in a prize fight primary? Political analyst Anita Mannion breaks it down for The Record. Banning TikTok, why Congress wants to force the sale of the popular social media company. Abortion politics heating up, why Missouri's Attorney General is suing Planned Parenthood. It's all coming up right now. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. Illinois voters will decide Tuesday the winner of a prize fight primary. Southern Illinois' 12th congressional district is home to one of the deepest red districts in the nation. Congressman Mike Bost has represented Southern Illinois in Congress for 10 years. The Marine veteran won an endorsement from former President Donald Trump in his bid for a 6th straight term. Bost now facing a challenge from Darren Bailey, the former State House representative and former state senator who ran against Governor Pritzker and lost in 2022. This is our final broadcast before the election, and we made every effort to put Darren Bailey on the record. Unfortunately, the candidate did not accept any of our invitations. Now we turn to political analyst Anita Mannion as we preview this race to the right. How do you rank Darren Bailey's chances, given that Speaker Mike Johnson, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, temporary Speaker designee Jim Jordan, who Bailey backed, all three of them, Annalise Stefanik and Donald Trump, and the NRCC, the list goes on, they're all defending Mike Bost. They came in heavy. You don't see that very often. What does that mean for Darren Bailey on Tuesday?
Well, it sounds like Mike Bost has the swamp behind him if you're Darren Bailey.
The swamp.
Right? And so Darren Bailey likes to rail against the establishment. And so I think his argument will be, yeah, these folks who are lining up behind Mike Bost are the people who are in office and want to keep one of their own in office. So I think that's how he would frame it. But this race definitely is competitive. The polling is kind of, there's different polls that say different things. But it's interesting because you would give Bost the edge as an incumbent, as having the endorsements. But he's running only for the second time in a newly designed district. And Bailey got a lot of name recognition from his gubernatorial campaign. And he previously had a Trump endorsement. So that makes this a lot more interesting and a lot more competitive.
You raise a really interesting point, perhaps something that might have sunk Rodney Davis 2 years ago, that he was fighting for a lot of, basically on the visitors' turf, a lot of new voters he had to introduce himself to. Mike Bost has only won an election, as you just said, in this district one time before. This Southern Illinois district was drawn to be one of the deepest red in the whole country.
Right.
So how do you think about that fact that Donald Trump and Nikki Haley, that race is already kind of decided? Who are the voters that are going to be showing up on Tuesday?
Yeah, this is one of the more interesting primary races. The presidential primary, for all purposes, is over. And so these are going to be the real base voters in the Republican Party. And so I think we can expect to see very conservative voters coming out and people who the campaigns have reached out to. So even given that, primary voter turnout is really low. So it's going to be a lot of who can turn out their voters to really show up on Election Day.
Cori Bush frames herself as a politivist, a political activist. Darren Bailey's kind of been that force on the right. From protesting a tax hike in 2017, that's the reason he jumped in to run for the State House, protesting vaccine mandates, suing Governor Pritzker over the stay-at-home order. Really, at every juncture, he's just been protesting things that are happening in government. He hasn't been, this is an objective statement, he has not yet been successful at passing anything into law or getting anything done, but it still seems that he's this vehicle for outrage. How much are voters looking for someone who can do that and maybe not the other thing?
That was sort of how Trump ran for office, right? He had never been in office or passed legislation, and he is a vehicle for outrage. And I think that Bailey is, taking up that mantle in a lot of ways, that he is pushing back against establishment entrenched politicians and saying, I'm out here fighting for you. I'm out here fighting for the real people in Illinois. And so we'll see if that message resonates with the voters in his district.
The contrast that Mike Bost paints is that he's the governing conservative. He likes to say he can represent those views and do something with them. I wonder how much of a gamble is it to bank so much of your political capital on the loyalty to Trump and then have him turn against you if you're Darren Bailey and endorse Mike Bost. How badly does that blunt his momentum?
I think that was a real wound for him. He has been endorsed by Trump before, and so I think he still tries to tout that. But if you're running as the MAGA candidate, but the actual Trump endorsed the other candidate, I think that is a real wound.
I'll give our viewers a little behind-the-scenes moment. We were covering a Mike Bost campaign rally a few weeks back, and a couple of Texas congressmen had come to town. One of them, Ronnie Jackson, former President Trump's former physician in the White House. and they were sort of pre-taping a little endorsement video that was to later go on Mike Boss' Facebook page. And Ronnie Jackson completed his first taping, and they all kind of looked at each other, and he thought, oh, wait a minute, let me do that again. I forgot to mention my closeness to President Trump. It was almost as if their entire purpose for coming to the district was to remind Southern Illinois voters Bost is with Trump.
Well, I think that this division we see in this primary race reflects a division in the Republican Party right now. We saw it in the race for Speaker of the House. And when you have insurgent folks in the party who really want to be disruptors and less governing. And I think that's sort of the matchup we're seeing here.
Perhaps some of the press could do more to focus on the policies than the personalities. Frankly, a lot of the bickering has been about the personalities. One policy difference, one key thing, and we would have liked to have asked the candidate Darren Bailey about this had he taken us up on our invitation to be here, but is on this thing about earmarks, federal spending. Should the public grade a member of Congress on their ability to bring home the bacon? Darren Bailey says no. Mary Miller has said no in Southern Illinois. Mike Boss says yes. That's a clear, distinct difference. Boss would go there and try to bring his position as leverage to fund projects in local cities and towns. Darren Bailey says he wouldn't do that. How should voters think about that when it comes to a member of Congress?
It is something that members of Congress like to tout, that I brought this money home to our district. You're seeing these roads improved, this money invested in our communities because I'm your member of Congress and I brought this home. And so even though people might be against earmarks in principle, see it as big government spending, deficit spending, when it comes down to it, people like things to get done in their district and money to be invested. And so I think that Boss does have a selling point there, even if Bailey's talking point might, be popular.
Well, and one other reason I've heard some of these, hard right folks talk about not using earmarks is because they don't want the perception that the leadership is wooing them or dangling a carrot to get them to vote for something that maybe the district back home won't like. So they're doing, but then, you could say you're not doing the job of bringing home the benefit that taxpayers paid for.
Right. I mean, even though we might not like it in principle, this is how things get done in politics and in government, right? There is an aspect of I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. We put these things into a bill that benefit your district and mine, and then we both vote on it. And that might seem unseemly to some people, but it is the reality of how things get done.
Is IVF really protected in Missouri law? The state's top lawyer chimes in on the discussion around frozen embryos. In Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker says he's taking on the insurance industry. Pritzker appearing at a press conference Thursday, promising to crack down on so-called step therapy. It's a practice insurance companies often use to try and require patients to use cheaper drugs before stepping up to more expensive ones. And Pritzker vowed to tighten their use of prior authorization, often a roadblock coming between patients and specialists.
12 other states have already banned junk insurance plans. It's time that we join them. The second part of the healthcare protection bill covers network adequacy. That's the standard insurance companies must meet to ensure that there are enough in-network doctors to treat consumers when and where they need healthcare.
Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey says he's suing the Planned Parenthood clinic in Columbia, Missouri. His lawsuit cites a man from the right-wing Project Veritas group. He recorded an undercover video while interacting with a Planned Parenthood employee about an imaginary patient who doesn't exist. The man pretends he has a pregnant 13-year-old niece who needs to travel to Kansas for an abortion across state lines. Planned Parenthood says the video is heavily doctored and selectively edited. They claim they do not directly provide any form of transportation and that minor parents are required by state law to have parental consent. The Missouri bar says a lawyer shall not knowingly offer evidence that the lawyer knows is false. Christine Byers asked the Attorney General how a case built on a lie can withstand scrutiny in court.
Well, it's no different than an investigator ensnaring a potential sexual predator by posing as an underage female. Those types of investigations occur all the time, and this is no different. But what we have is an agent of Planned Parenthood gleefully expressing a willingness and bragging about having, in the past, violated state statutes as it concerns the requirements to transport minors out of state if they're going to obtain an abortion. And forging documents, lying to parents, lying to school officials, lying to courts about how they accomplish that objective. I would also say that at the end of the day, the clinic was a mandatory reporter of a sexual offense against a minor. And here, the victim in the investigative video poses as a 13-year-old who's pregnant. Well, a 13-year-old can't consent to sex under the law. And so there was a sexual offense that occurred against a minor. The clinic, rather than concealing that fact, had a duty under the law to report that fact.
Missouri law says a doctor must be engaged in the examination, care, treatment, or research of persons to be a mandated reporter. A mandated reporter has an obligation to report abuse if they observed it or if they have, quote, reasonable cause to suspect that a child has been or may be subjected to abuse or neglect. Missouri State Senator Tracy McCreary filed a bill this month to update the state's legal definition of an unborn child. Her measure would make sure any criminal penalties associated with abortion would not apply to, quote, embryos created through in vitro fertilization prior to successful implantation. In other words, frozen embryos that have never been implanted into a mother's womb. Our public safety reporter, Christine Byers, asked Attorney General Andrew Bailey if he would support a bill like that.
I believe that life begins at conception.
Even outside of the womb.
Absolutely. And our law should protect innocent life. I also believe that potential parents, individuals who want to be able to have children, should have every means available to them to be able to fulfill that dream of theirs.
So when it comes to destroying unused frozen embryos, where do you stand?
I believe that's morally wrong.
This week, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a controversial bill that could eventually lead to the ban of a popular social media app. Reporters on the Hill asked Missouri Senator Josh Hawley and Illinois Senator Dick Durbin if that bill might pass to the president's desk.
It could, but I tell you, there are a lot of questions my colleagues are asking, myself included. I haven't come to a final decision as to whether or not it should be banned. I'd rather see TikTok step forward and divest themselves of any Chinese involvement.
An area lawmaker is pushing for stricter rules for kids online. Illinois State Senator Erica Harris introduced the Adult Content Age Verification Act. It would require businesses to create verification methods on specific types of content. Harris says the bill would prevent young people from viewing pornographic content.
If you click on a pornographic site right now, there is no pop-up. It doesn't matter what age you are, you're automatically on the content. 20 years ago, you walked into a video store and children didn't go see that content because it was behind a curtain and that was only for adults to walk behind.
That bill would also allow the Attorney General to investigate any business that distributes pornographic material. An expansion of the Radioactive Exposure Compensation Act passed in the U.S. Senate a little over a week ago. It now faces challenges in the U.S. House. Shortly after it passed, Congresswoman Ann Wagner says she'll do everything she can to get it signed into law, but she warned some of her Republican colleagues may have concerns about the bloated cost. Last week, Wagner joined Congresswoman Cori Bush in urging House Speaker Mike Johnson to approve it. They're pushing for it to become a part of the upcoming appropriations bill. Welcome back. Congress is pushing to force Chinese-owned company ByteDance to sell TikTok. So how could a proposal like that impact the youth vote? Let's check back in with political analyst Anita Mannion. The government says that China can use TikTok to spy on Americans, but this is the same government that has used technology to spy on Americans. I understand China has different intent than our government does, and there's a distinct difference there, but how can a measure like this, moving to ban TikTok or force its sale, impact public trust at a moment like this?
Yeah, public trust in institutions has been trending down for some time now, and particularly among younger generations. There isn't allegiance to political parties, there isn't as much trust in institutions, including the courts, and so taking away this one thing that they use every day and use to communicate could further push them away from, politics and seeing that positively.
Just how powerful is that TikTok hold on the younger voter, and could this, I'm going to use the term backfire, in a sense that it engages a lot of voters who were previously kind of tuned out?
Yeah, TikTok has effectively mobilized them. They did a big push where members of Congress were frustrated because they were getting bombarded from calls and emails and contacts from TikTok users. And so, yeah, this has mobilized that group, and it could backfire if this is something that brings you joy or you make money off of, you run your business off of, you connect with others on. It could certainly push those younger voters who tend to be Democratic voters.
Some of the topics, the types of content that are pulling people together on TikTok, these little online communities. What are some of those issues that stand out to you? Like the people that are now going to be more engaged politically looking at this and saying, wait a minute, you're taking this voice.
Yeah, this conversation has been going on for years now, even including under the Trump administration had looked into.
He supported it.
He did, supported banning TikTok. And so this isn't a new conversation, but I think a number of things have pushed it forward, including continuing tensions with China, and the recognition from some members of Congress that the hashtags that are pro-Palestinian are getting a lot more traction than the pro-Israel hashtags, and the perception that interactions and engagements on TikTok can be driving some of this backlash for the Biden administration about what's happening in Gaza, and could also be driving maybe some anti-Semitism. So that has pushed some members of Congress to support this bill. We saw overwhelming vote.
It's sometimes easy in DC circles to think, well, that must be China skewing the algorithms. But you look at American-run social media, and you can find a whole lot of I'll just say filth circulating, or you can find radical ideas. You can find all kinds of things circulating.
Absolutely.
So I'm not sure there's a guarantee that if this company is owned by an American-based company that it's going to behave any differently. We already saw one attempt from someone who was apparently working for the Dean Phillips campaign, indirectly perhaps, to try and voice clone President Biden using AI, artificial intelligence-generated deepfake technology. You can just imagine the possibilities if malicious misinformation or deep fakes were to start spreading on TikTok.
Yeah, I think it is a valid concern. And you mentioned that the fear that China could be spying on us or stealing our data. I think the other fear is the spreading of misinformation or propaganda, particularly in an election year. And like you said, we have clear evidence that that kind of information is spread on American-owned platforms. But I think that particularly with fewer protections in place, and that the Chinese government might want to put their thumb on the scale, that those fears have heightened.
Closer to home, Missouri's Attorney General Andrew Bailey has started to sue Planned Parenthood. I want to get your reaction. The question is, does that immunity to prosecute or investigate crimes that way extend to like a citizen journalist? I don't know. It's just an interesting thing. The Missouri bar has ethical codes that say you can't bring fraudulent evidence into court. This kind of seems like it's playing along those ethical lines here somewhere.
Yeah, I would say generally courts don't like to operate in hypotheticals, and so we are dealing with a fictitious situation here. And the people who were investigating were not journalists and certainly not police officers. So I think that makes the case much weaker than if you had a real person who had experienced this. Also, Project Veritas has a history of deceptively editing videos, and so we don't know what the full video shows, what they told the workers the circumstances were, the full information the workers gave back to them, which I would imagine would come out in the court case. But I think it would be strengthen their case if, the Attorney General has examples of actual people who've had this experience, not just a doctored video.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps that evidence exists, we just don't know, and so it's hard to speculate. One thing he said, though, is that Planned Parenthood was a mandated reporter if a crime occurred, but we don't necessarily know that a crime occurred.
Yeah, we don't know what scenario
Especially not if there's a fake person. But
that's right. So we don't know what scenario was presented. We don't, they mentioned that the girl was 13, but we don't know what age the person who allegedly impregnated this fictitious girl was. And so I think there's a lot of stretches made in this lawsuit that lead a lot of people to believe that this is, as Attorney General Bailey has said, part of his campaign to drive Planned Parenthood out of the state, and is also part of his campaign for election.
A lot more to get into on that, but on the issue of IVF, in vitro fertilization, there are now bills popping up in the bipartisan bills, I would say, Republicans and Democrats in Missouri, to try and protect access to IVF by changing the definition of what an unborn child is. Senator Tracy McCreary's bill would do that, to say that any frozen embryo that has not yet been successfully implanted would not have the same protections as an unborn child. The Attorney General disagrees with that. What are the political implications for a statement like that in a year like this when abortion could be on the ballot?
Yeah, IVF is a procedure that is overwhelmingly supported by Americans of all political stripes, ages, religions. Former President Trump has come out in support of it. But if you're running in a Republican primary and trying to be more conservative than the other person and really get the right to life vote, perhaps this is a strategy. Also, presumably, it's what he really believes and his values. But it may not play well among general election voters who overwhelmingly support IVF, and it will be interesting to see if even primary-based voters support that position.
Good to see you. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thanks, you too.
There's an election Tuesday in Illinois. Many of you may be tempted to think it doesn't matter. The top of the ticket is already sorted out after all. So let's check the record. President Franklin Roosevelt said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote, except the American people themselves. And the only way they could do that is by not voting at all. That does it for us this week. We'll see you right back here at the same time next week. Until then, we're off the record.